So this summary video is on chapter 25, which is laws of debtor-creditor relations and consumer protection. So to start off, a creditor is the lender in a transaction, and a debtor is the borrower in a transaction. Rights of and remedies for creditors. Lien is claim on a debitor's property that must be satisfied before any creditor can make a claim. A mortgage foreclosure. Mortgages have a right to foreclose on real property when a debtor or mortgagor defaults. A suitorship is a contract between a third party and a creditor that allows the third party to pay the debt of the debtor. Rights of and remedies for creditors again. A guarantee is similar to a suitorship, except that the third person is secondarily liable. Types of lien. Mechanic's lien and an artisan's lien. A mechanic's lien is placed on the real property of a debtor when the latter does not pay for the work done by the creditor. An artisan's lien enables a creditor to recover payment from a debtor for labor and services provided on the debtor's personal property. It includes attachment, writ of execution, and garnishment. Goals of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. To allow equitable distribution of the debtor's property among the debtor's creditors. Discharge the debtor from its debts, enabling the debtor to rehabilitate itself and start fresh. Preserve ongoing business relations and stabilize commercial usage. Bankruptcy management and proceedings. U.S. district courts have exclusive jurisdiction over all bankruptcy cases. Bankruptcy petitions are voluntary or involuntary. Bankruptcy schedules are lists and statements to be submitted after the debtor files a voluntary petition. They're also prepared with the assistance of attorneys who specialize in bankruptcy law. The bankruptcy court schedules a meeting of the creditors. Bankruptcy trustee is appointed for cases in which fraud, dishonesty, or incompetence is found. Atomic stay is immediate suspension of creditors' activity once a debtor files for bankruptcy. Relief from a stay can be granted to secured creditors. And a discharge is when all the requirements are met, the court relieves the debtor of responsibility to pay its debts. Bankruptcy estate is a legal entity created upon commencement of a bankruptcy case. Estate exemptions, list of exempt property and assets. State exemptions or states are permitted to allow their own exemptions, and fraudulent transfers are where courts can void fraudulent transfers of the debtor's property. Talk about straight bankruptcy, which is when a debtor turns all assets over to a trustee, and the trustee sells the non-exempt assets and distributes the proceeds to creditors. Discharge of debts is a debtor is not legally responsible for paying certain claims by creditors on unsecured debts. It's not available to partnerships and limited liability companies and corporations under the Federal Bankruptcy Code. Talk about wage earners plan, which is a portion of the consumer debtor's earnings is paid into the court for distribution to creditors over 3 years, which can be extended to 5 years with court approval. It applies to wage earners and individuals engaged in businesses. It permits only voluntary petitions for bankruptcy. Talk about the types of bankruptcy proceedings. So like purpose, this can be like liquidation, reorganization, and adjustment. Eligible debtors are most debtors. Type of petition, voluntary or involuntary. Talk about the new bankruptcy law in 2011. Amendment of the 2005 Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act. The technical corrections affected the power of the court, public access to papers, debtor reporting requirements, case administration, and priorities of creditors' claims. The freedom to contract doctrine. Parties who are legally competent are allowed to enter contracts of their choice. It upheld the principle of caveat emptor, which is let the buyer beware. And the government acts as a referee between consumers and businesses. The Federal Trade Commission functions as the leading federal consumer protection agency. It's composed of a chairperson and 4 commissioners who are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Its enforcement powers are investigation of complaints of unfair or deceptive practices under Section 5 of the FTCA. The Truth in Lending Act, the goals were to make creditors disclose all terms of a credit arrangement before they enter into agreement with a consumer debtor. The scope applies to creditors that regularly extend credit for less than $25,000 to natural persons, and corporations and persons applying for more than $25,000 in credit. It's general disclosure. Finance charges are monitored by Regulation Z. Has an annual percentage rate, right to cancel a contract, open and close end credit transactions, and credit advertising. Talk about the Credit Card Accountability, Responsibility, and Disclosure Act of 2009. Electronic Fund Transfer Act. The Fair Credit Reporting Act, Identity Theft and Credit Ratings. Which identity theft is the use of another's name to obtain some illegal gain through financial instruments held or owned by another, and criminal liability is incurred by a person who knowingly and willfully obtains information of a consumer from a consumer reporting agency under false pretenses. Talk about Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Fair Credit Billing Act, Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the Dodd-Frank Act and Consumer Protection, state consumer legislation, which is Uniform Consumer Credit Code, which aims to implement a uniform state law for consumer credit. It takes a disclosure approach to consumer credit similar to that of the federal legislation. And then Unfair and Deceptive Practices Statutes attempts to combat consumer fraud at the state level. Arbitration of consumer disputes. State attorneys encourage private groups to solve disputes out of court. Talk about the standardization of advertising is hindered by different views on consumer protection, protection of competition, the standards of morality and nationalism, consumer protection, where countries differ in the amount of deception permitted in advertising, and the EU has similar approach to Section 5 of the FTCA.